There were several rooms back here, all leading off a short hall, all the doors closed. I rapped on the first one, and when a woman said yes, I opened it and checked out the room. She was a stacked redhead in a leotard, doing ballet steps in front of a mirror to the sounds, now, of Megadeth. 10 chairs were lined up against the walls around the room, and in each chair sat a different ventriloquist dummy. Some held bananas in their wooden hands. I didn't want to know any more about it. "Sorry," I said. "Wrong room." I closed the door and went to the one across the hall. Graham Stone was there. He stood by the desk, watching me with those cold eyes. I stepped inside, closed the door, and took the Smith & Wesson out of my pocket to be certain that he understood the situation. "Stand real still," I said. He didn't move, and he didn't answer me. When I started toward him, however, he sidestepped. I cocked the .38, but it didn't grab his attention like it should have. He watched disinterestedly. I walked forward again, and he moved again. I'd had the word from Bruno that a bring-him-back-alive clause was not a condition of my employment contract. In fact, the bear had implied that any display of mercy on my part would be met with all the savagery of a Hare Krishna panhandler on a megadose of PCP. Well, he hadn't put it quite that way, but I got the message. So I shot Graham Stone in the chest, point blank, because I had no way of knowing what he might be able to do to me. The bullet ripped through him, and he sagged, folded onto the desk, fell to the floor, and deflated. Inside of 6 seconds, he was nothing more than a pile of tissue paper painted to look like a man. A 3-dimensional snakeskin that shed was still convincingly real. I examined the remains. No blood, no bones, just ashes. I looked at the Smith & Wesson. It was my familiar gun, not a Disney 780 Deathos, which meant that this hadn't been the real Graham Stone, but something else, an amazing construct of some kind that was every bit as convincing as it was flimsy. Before I had too much time to think about that, I beat it back into the corridor. No one had heard the shot. The thrash masters on the bandstand were doing a fair imitation of Megadeth, a bitchin' number from Euthanasia, and providing perfect cover. Now what? I cautiously checked the other 2 rooms that opened off the hallway, and I found Graham Stone in both. He crumpled between my fingers in the first room, as solid in appearance as any face on Mount Rushmore, but was, in actuality, as insubstantial as any current politician's image. In the second room, I shredded him with a well-placed kick to the crotch. By the time I reached the dance floor again, I was furious. When you blew a guy away, you expected him to go down like bricks and stay down. That was how the game was played. I didn't like this cheap trick. In the washroom, I rapped on Bruno's stall door, and he came out with his hat still pulled way down and his collar still turned up. Face wrinkled in disgust, he said, "If you people don't bother flushing, why even put the lever on the toilet to begin with?" "There's trouble," I said. I told him about the 3 extra Graham Stones and demanded some explanation. "I didn't want to have to tell you this." He looked sheepish. "I was afraid it would scare you, affect your efficiency." "What? Tell me what?" I asked. He shrugged his burly shoulders. "Well, Graham Stone isn't a human being." I almost laughed. "Neither are you." He looked hurt, and I felt like a blockhead. "I am a little bit human," he said. certain borrowed genetic material. But forget that. What I should have said is that Graham Stone doesn't really come from any alternate Earth. He's an alien from another star system. I went to the sink and splashed a lot of cold water on my face. It didn't do much good. "Tell me," I said. "Not the whole story," he said. "That would take too much time. Stone is an alien, humanoid except when you're close enough to see that he doesn't have any pores. And if you look closely at his hands, you'll see where he's had his 6 fingers amputated to pass for human." 6-finger amputation scar. Always a sure indicator of the alien among us, I said sarcastically. "Yes, exactly. There was a shipload of these creatures that crashed on one of the probability lines 7 months ago. We've never been able to communicate with them. They're extremely hostile and very strange. The general feeling is that we've met a species of megalomaniacs. All have been terminated except Graham Stone. He's escaped us thus far." "If he's an alien, why the British-sounding name?" "That's the first name he went by when he started to pass for human. There have been others since. Apparently, even aliens seem to feel that being British has a certain connotation of class and style. It's also a constant on 80% of the timelines, although there are a couple of realities wherein being from the island nation of Tonga is the epitome of class." "And what the hell has this alien done to deserve death?" I asked. "Maybe if a greater attempt was made to understand him, an attempt was made. One morning when the doctors arrived at the labs for a continuation of the study, they found the entire night crew dead. A spiderweb fungus was growing out of their mouths, nostrils, eye sockets. You get the picture? He hasn't done it since, but we don't think he has lost the capacity." I went back to the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. Someone came in to use the urinal, and Bruno leaped backward into the toilet stall and slammed the door. "Ah, yuck!" he growled. But the newcomer didn't seem to find anything strange about the bearish voice. I had 3 minutes to study my precious kisser in the mirror until the headbanger left. Then Bruno came out again, grimacing worse than ever. "Listen," I said. "Suppose Stone was within 20 feet of me, back there in the offices, while I was playing around with those paper decoys or whatever the hell they were. He could have tripped right out of this probability by now." "No," Bruno said. "You're a receiver, not a transmitter. You'll have to locate someone with the reverse talent of yours before he can get out of this timeline." "Are there others?" "I detect 2 within the city," Bruno said. "We could just stake those 2 out and wait for him." Hardly," the Bruin said. "He would just as soon settle down here and take over a world line for himself. That would give him a better base with which to strike out against the other continuums." "He has that kind of power?" "I said he was dangerous." "Let's move it," I said, turning to the steel door from the adjacent warehouse basement. "You're marvelous," Bruno said. I turned and looked at him, trying to find sarcasm in that crazy face of his. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. "Marvelous? I'm marvelous. Listen, one guy doesn't tell another guy he's marvelous, especially not when the 2 of them are in a bathroom." "Why?" "Never mind why," I said, starting to burn. "Anyway, I'm not a guy, I'm a bear." "You're a guy bear, aren't you?" "Well, yes. So can it with this marvelous crap?" All I meant was, in the space of a few short hours, you have accepted the existence of probability worlds, an intelligent bear, and an alien from another world, and you don't seem shaken at all. I set him straight. Yesterday, I got good and drunk. I spent 6 active hours in bed with a great blonde named Sylvia. I ate 2 steaks, half a dozen eggs, and piles of fried potatoes. I sweated out every drop of tension from the last job I took on. I'm a purged man. I can take anything tonight. Nobody has ever thrown anything at me that I can't take. And it isn't going to start with this. Besides, I have $3,000 at stake, to say nothing about a little thing called pride. Now let's get the hell out of here. We went through the steel door and the wood door beyond it into the basement of the abandoned warehouse. 4. When we got back on the street again, we discovered that an inch of snow had fallen since we'd gone into the warehouse, and the storm had cranked up 2 notches. Hard snow whipped about us, pasted our clothes, stung our faces. I cursed, but Bruno just accepted it and said nothing. What seemed like a millennium later, and some 10 million miles from the metal bar where I had almost cornered Stone, using the color-changing disc as our guide, we found some of the shifty alien's handiwork. 5 teenage boys were lying in an alleyway, all with a white gossamer fungus growing out of their mouths, eyes, nostrils, even their rectums, for all I knew. "I was afraid of this," Bruno said, genuine anguish in his voice. "Don't sweat it," I said, bending to look more closely at the corpses. They weren't pretty. They're thugs, delinquents, members of some street gang. They just as soon shoot your sister as eat a donut. It's a new gang to me. See the cobra? Each one has tattooed on his hand. They probably tried to mug Graham and had the old proverbial tables turned on them. For once, Graham did something worthwhile. They won't be snatching welfare money from old ladies and beating grandfathers up to steel pocket watches. "Just the same," he said, "we have to dispose of the bodies. We can't allow these to be found. There'll be a lot of questions about what killed them. And this probability line is not yet ready to be taken into the World Travel Societies." "Why's that?" "Credit problems." "So, what do you propose?" I asked. He took that strange pistol out of his pocket, changed the setting on the regulator dial on the butt, then ashed all the dead gangbangers. He was right about the Disney 780 death hose. It was the mother of all ray guns. As we stirred the gray residue around with our feet and let the wind blow it away, I didn't feel so good. I kept reminding myself about the $3,000 and Sylvia and the taste of good scotch, and how I would lose all those things if I once let my nerve crack. Because, see, once a Private Richard backs down, his career is finished. Either his career or his life. After the snowplows had passed, we walked in the middle of the street, where we didn't have to fight the drifting snow. At first, the tracking disc was little more than amber, but it soon began to change to a brilliant orange. As redness crept in around its edges, our spirits rose again. We eventually had to leave the street for the river park, where the untouched snow soaked my socks and trouser cuffs. As the wafer in Bruno's hand grew brighter red than it had been all evening, we topped the knoll and saw Graham Stone. He was at the end of a pier at the yacht basin. He scrambled onto the deck of a sleek boat, ran for the wheelhouse door, swung up the steps, and disappeared inside. The running lights popped on along the length of the boat, and the engines coughed and stuttered to life. I ran down the hill, my pistol in my right hand, while I thrust my other arm forward to break any fall I might make on the slippery ground. Behind me, Bruno was shouting something. I didn't listen to it. He shouted it again, then started running after me. I could tell he was running, even without looking, for I could hear his big feet slamming the ground. When I reached the end of the pier, Stone had reversed the boat and was taking it out into the dark river. As I ran the last few yards, I judged the distance to the deck of the receding craft at maybe 12 feet. I leaped, fell over the rail of the boat in a tangle of arms and legs, smacked the polished deck with my shoulder, and watched the pretty stars for a moment. Behind me, I heard a bellow of frustration, then a huge splash. Bruno hadn't made it. From where I lay, I could look up into the wheelhouse windows. Graham Stone stood up there, staring down at me. Maybe the real creature, or maybe just another of his shed skins. I pushed to my feet, shook those stars out of my head, and looked for my gun. It was gone. I glanced back toward the pier. There was no sign of Bruno. And somewhere in the intervening stretch of dark water, my .38 lay in river muck, useless. I didn't feel so good. I wished that I had never left the ace spot this morning, had never met Bruno. Then I shook off all the negative thoughts and started looking around for something I could use as a weapon. If you start wishing things were different from what they are, the next step is depression, then inactivity, and finally vegetation. No matter what the state of the world, you have got to move. Move. I found a length of pipe in a tool chest that was bolted to the deck against the far railing. I could cave in a skull very nicely if I put the proper swing behind it. I felt better. Stone was still in the wheelhouse, still watching me. The blue eyes gleamed with the reflection of the ship lights. He seemed too confident as I walked along the deck to the steps. I swung inside, crouching low. I kept the pipe extended, and he didn't even bother to turn and look at me. I approached carefully, using mincing little steps, because I hated to commit myself to more than a few inches at a time. I kept thinking of the 5 young thugs lying back there with the cobweb fungus growing out of their bodies. When I was close enough, I swung the pipe in a short, vicious arc. It slammed into his head and on down through his neck and chest and stomach and thighs. Another snakeskin. The lousy simulacrum collapsed, seemed to dissolve, and was a little pile of wrinkled, useless tissue at my feet. Damn him! Or should I say it? When I looked through the bridge window, I could see that we were more than halfway across the river toward the West Shore district of the city. The boat was on automatic pilot. I couldn't make anything of the controls, and though I worked them at random, safeguards must have kept anything from changing. More wary than I had been, I left the wheelhouse in search of Stone. I found him by the toolbox where I had found the piece of pipe. He gripped the railing with both hands and stared longingly at the approaching shore where we would surely run aground. I sneaked up behind him, and I let him have it hard. It was another tissue paper construction. I wished I knew how the bastard made those things. It was a handy talent. We were 2/3 of the way to shore now, and if I didn't find him soon, he might escape us again. And Bruno had explained that a few days in any one probability will dissipate the residual energy across time travel, rendering the tracking disk useless. Stone had to be below deck. I could see all of the planking above the waterline, and I knew the wheelhouse was empty, so I found the hatch and the stairs to the lower cabins. I went down like any good Private Richard learns to do, carefully. In the galley was another simulacrum, which I heroically crumpled with my trusty pipe. I felt like an idiot, but I was not about to take it easy with one of them, and then discover that it was a real and deadly thing. I found another paper demon in the first of the double-bunk sleeping quarters and dispatched him quickly. The second sleeping cabin was empty, containing neither a scarecrow, Graham Stone, nor the real one. Which left the bathroom. The door was closed, but not locked. I twisted the lever, yanked it open, and found him. For a moment I was disoriented. Before me was the real Graham Stone and a false shell separating from him. It looked like I had double vision, with the two images overlapping slightly. Then he snarled and smashed the simulacrum away as it separated from him. On his hands, ugly brown bubbles of flesh rose up, burst free, and spun at me like biological missiles. I stepped backward, swung the pipe, and broke open one of the spinning seeds, spores, whatever the hell they were. Instantly, the end of the pipe was sheathed in writhing white fibers. The fungus spread inexorably down toward my hand, and I had to drop the pipe. The second bubble had struck the door jamb. A colony of cobweb fungus wriggled along the wood and aluminum, anchoring itself, spreading outward in all directions. "Hold it right there," I said, pretending that I was tough. His hands came up again. I could see the spores forming. The skin turned brown, bulged, leaped away from him. One of them burst down the wall next to me and sent climbing white tendrils toward the ceiling and the floor. Cracks appeared in the fiberboard as the stuff ate its way into the core of the ship. The second spore struck my sports coat sleeve, exploded with a bubbling froth of white growth. Never before or since have I stripped off a coat that fast, not even when a delectable blonde was waiting for me and cooing sweet things. I nearly strangled myself in the damn thing, but I got rid of it. By the time the coat hit the floor, the albino frowns were trembling like the hairs on the back of my neck. Stone stepped out of the bathroom into the companionway, raising those hands at me again, and I turned and ran like hell. Once before, I said that a private detective is finished when his nerve cracks, that the first time he backs down is the point at which his career begins to terminate. Well, I stand by that. I wasn't turning chicken. I was just using my head for once. Those who fight and run away live to fight another day. So I ran. There are times when you know it isn't sensible to take on a tank with a target pistol, because you'll be standing there holding your target pistol and looking at the 12-inch hole they just put in your gut. Besides, this creepy Stone character wasn't playing the same game I was. He didn't know the rules. Even the crummiest 2-bit punk will give you half a chance. He'll use a rod, or a knife, or even a jar full of sulfuric acid, but nothing this tricky. Stone didn't have any respect for tradition. Topside, I ran to the bow of the craft and checked the onrushing bank of the river. It seemed no more than 200 feet away now. It was the most welcome sight of my life. On the rail next to me, a pod of fibrous death split and wrapped spidery tentacles around the iron, bored into the metal, and began to greedily devour it. I was struck with the notion that these pods were more virulent than those that had killed the gangbangers in the alleyway. I dove to the right, behind an exhaust housing. Cautiously, I peered over the top and saw Stone standing by the wheelhouse steps, his bright eyes flashing his palms flattened in my direction. The boat rushed closer to the shore, but not fast enough to suit me. 2 pods spun over my head, landed on the deck behind, and ate down through the planking. Before long, the yacht was going to be honeycombed with the white tentacles, each as thin as a thread, but as strong, surely, as a steel wire. A whining sound arose, the sound of tortured metal. The deck of the boat shuddered, and we seemed almost to come to a stop. Then there was a jolt, and we sped forward again. The bottom had dragged over a shoreline rock formation, but we had not been grounded. And then we were. The boat hit the second reef, tore out its bottom, and settled into 4 feet of water, most of its bulk still high and dry. I rolled back across the deck, grabbed the rail, heaved myself over the side. I struck shallow water and went under, striking my jaw on a hunk of smooth driftwood. My mouth sagged open and I swallowed water. So this is what it's like to drown, I thought. Then I closed my stupid kisser and struggled to the surface again. I broke water, flailed my arms, pushed up and staggered toward that blessed beach, sputtering and coughing and trying not to pass out. I may not have a number of qualities that modern society considers admirable, like refined tastes and finesse. But there's one thing I do have, damn it. Grit. I was 5 short steps from dry ground when the pods of fungus erupted before me. 2. Then 2 more. A wild tangle of white snakes rose up to block my escape. I turned and looked back. Graham Stone, alien Anglophile, looking like an evil Cary Grant, had left the ship too. He was splashing toward me. I turned to my right. 2 spores fell there. The pale snakes twisted out of the water, seeking, wriggling toward me. On my left, 2 more. No respect for tradition at all. The water was only halfway up my calves, not deep enough for me to go beneath the surface and swim away. Besides, if the fungus was going to take me, I'd rather it happened up here, where I could see what those filaments were doing. Graham Stone came relentlessly onward, holding his fire now. He knew he had me. We were on a dark stretch of shore, no one to whom I could call for help. Then, from the left arose the furious whine of a small powerboat driven to the limits of its performance. A whooping siren wailed to life, one of those ooga horns from ancient automobiles. Out of the gloom and the falling snow, Bruno appeared. He was standing in a 2-seat 12-footer, holding onto the wheel for all he was worth. The craft was hitting better than 50 miles an hour. It skimmed the water, the bow in the air. Since the boat sat higher in the water than the yacht, it passed over the rock formations and kept coming. "Bruno!" I shouted. He was a textbook example of a man, or a bear, in the grip of an anxiety attack. His big eyes rolled wildly, and he braced for the worst. The little boat hit the beach, the screws churning frantically. It slammed forward through the sand at 20 miles an hour for 10 feet or so, struck a rock, stopped dead, and pitched the Bruin over the windshield, across the bow, and onto the beach, flat on his enormous back. And he got up. He looked dizzy, and he was covered with sand, but he had survived. I started jumping up and down in the water, yelling, "Get him, Bruno! Get him now!" Those white tentacles were threading their way closer to me, even though Graham Stone had stopped approaching. The bear raised his head, looked at me, felt for his floppy hat, then shrugged when he couldn't find it. "Get him, Bruno! Get him!" I bellowed. He took out that silly-looking pistol of his, and while Stone tried to hit him with a spore of fungus, my friend, the bear, burned the son of a bitch on the spot with the Disney 780 death hose. The only thing left was some ashes, which floated away. I knew I was going to have to get one of those. Maybe Mickey Mouse sold them out of a secret shop in Tomorrowland. "You kill him!" I shouted as Bruno burned down the white forest of fungus on all other sides of me. Then I must have had an attack of low blood sugar or something, because I passed out. I'm sure I didn't faint. 5. We had to dispose of the yacht. In about 15 seconds, when Bruno was done with it, it was only a dusting of ashes slowly washing away on the water. No fire, really, just whoosh, and it was nothing but dust. He destroyed the powerboat, too. Every trace of what had taken place here this evening. We walked the dark shore for about a mile, until we found a waterside club where we could call a cab, and went back to my place. The driver kept wanting to know if Bruno had won the prize at the costume party, but we didn't answer him. At home, we cleaned up, ate every steak in my refrigerator, every egg, every slice of cheese, everything. Then we finished off 3 bottles of scotch between us, though I have to admit that he drank most of it himself. We didn't talk about Graham Stone once. We talked a lot about being a cop, both the private and the badge-carrying kind. We talked about the types of punks that work out there, and discovered that they don't vary much from probability to probability. He explained why my Earth is not civilized enough to be welcomed into the probability societies, besides that credit thing. Strangely, he said that it won't be quite good enough until my type has all but vanished from the face of the Earth. Yet he liked me. I'm sure of that. Strange. Shortly before dawn, he gave himself an injection that sobered him instantly. We shook hands, or at least he reached down and shook mine, and parted company. He went off to find a transmitting point to return to his own probability, and I went to sleep. I never saw Bruno again. But there have been other odd characters, stranger than all the crooks I've known in this city, stranger than Benny the Ostrich Deacle-Baker, and Sam the Plunger Sullivan, stranger than Hunchback Haggerty, the deformed hired killer. Stranger, in fact, than either Graham Stone or Bruno. I'll tell you about them sometime. Right now, I've got a date with the cutest redhead you ever saw. Her name's Lorella. She can dance like a dream. And aside from a weird interest in ventriloquist dummies, she's got her head on straight.
The Night of the Storm. He was a robot more than 100 years old, built by other robots in an automated factory that had been continuously engaged in the production of robots for many centuries. His name was Kuranov, and as was the custom of his kind, he roamed the earth in search of interesting things to do. Kuranov had climbed the highest mountains in the world with the aid of special body attachments, spikes in his metal feet, tiny but strong hooks on the ends of his 12 fingers, an emergency grappling hook coiled inside his chest area storage compartment and ready for a swift ejection if he should fall. His small anti-gravity flight motors were removed to make the climb as dangerous and, therefore, as interesting as possible. Having submitted to heavy-duty component sealing procedures, Kuranov had once spent 18 months underwater, exploring a large portion of the Pacific Ocean, until he was bored even by the mating of whales and by the ever-shifting beauty of the sea bottom. Koontz had crossed deserts, explored the Arctic Circle on foot, gone spelunking in countless different subterranean systems. He had been caught in a blizzard, in a major flood, in a hurricane, and in the middle of an earthquake that would have registered 9 on the Richter scale, if the Richter scale had still been in use. Once, specially insulated, he had descended halfway to the center of the earth, there to bask in pockets of glowing gases, between pools of molten stone, scalded by eruptions of magma, feeling nothing. Eventually, he grew weary of even that colorful spectacle, and he surfaced again. Having lived only one of his 2 assigned centuries, he wondered if he could last through another 100 years of such tedium. Kuronov's private counselor, a robot named Bickermean, assured him that this boredom was only temporary and easily alleviated. If one was clever, Bickermean said, one could find limitless excitement as well as innumerable valuable situations for data collection about one's environment and one's mechanical aptitude and heritage. Bickermean, in the last half of his 2nd century, had developed such an enormous and complex data vault that he was assigned stationary duty as a counselor, attached to a mother computer, utterly immobile. By now, extremely adept at finding excitement even through second-hand experience, Bickermean did not mourn the loss of his mobility. He was, after all, a spiritual superior to most robots, inwardly directed. Therefore, when Bickermean advised, Kuronov listened, however skeptical he might be. Kuronov's problem, according to Bickermean, was that he had started out in life from the moment he'd left the factory to pit himself against the greatest of forces, the wildest sea, the coldest cold, the highest temperatures, the greatest pressures, and now, having conquered these things, he could see no interesting challenges beyond them. Yet, the counselor said that Kuronov had overlooked some of the most fascinating explorations. The quality of any challenge was directly related to one's ability to meet it. The less adequate one felt, the better the experience, the richer the contest, and the more handsome the data reward. "Does this suggest anything to you?" Bickermean inquired, without speaking, the telebeam open between them. "Nothing." So Bickermean explained it. Hand-to-hand combat with a full-grown male ape might seem like an uninteresting, easy challenge at first glance. A robot was the mental and physical superior of any ape. However, one could always modify oneself in order to even the odds of what might appear to be a sure thing. If a robot couldn't fly, couldn't see as well at night as in the daylight, couldn't communicate except vocally, couldn't run faster than an antelope, couldn't hear a whisper at 1,000 yards. In short, if all of his standard abilities were dulled, except for his thinking capacity, might not a robot find that a hand-to-hand battle with an ape was a supremely exciting event? "I see your point," Kuronov admitted. "To understand the grandeur of simple things, one must humble himself." Exactly. And so it was that, on the following day, Kuronov boarded the express train north to Montana, where he was scheduled to do some hunting in the company of 4 other robots, all of whom had been stripped to their essentials. Ordinarily, they would have flown under their own power. Now none had that ability. Ordinarily, they would have used telebeams for communication. Now they were forced to talk to one another in that curious clicking language that had been designed especially for machines, but that robots had been able to do without for more than 600 years. Ordinarily, the thought of going north to hunt deer and wolves would have profoundly bored them. Now, however, each of them felt a curious tingle of anticipation, as if this were a more important ordeal than any he had faced before. A brisk, efficient robot named Janus met the group at the small station house just outside of Walker's Watch, toward the northernmost border of Montana. To Kurinov, it was clear that Janus had spent several months in this uneventful duty assignment, and that he might be near the end of his obligatory 2 years' service to the Central Agency. He was actually too brisk and efficient. He spoke rapidly, and he behaved altogether as if he must keep moving and doing in order not to have the time to contemplate the uneventful and unexciting days that he had spent in Walker's watch. He was one of those robots too eager for excitement. One day he would tackle a challenge that he had not been prepared for, and he would end himself. Kurinov looked at Tuttle, another robot who, on the train north, had begun an interesting if silly argument about the development of the robot personality. He contended that until quite recently, in terms of centuries, robots hadn't possessed individual personalities. Each, Tuttle claimed, had been like the other, cold and sterile, with no private dreams. A patently ridiculous theory. Tuttle had been unable to explain how this could have been, but he refused to back down from his position. Now, watching Janus chatter at them in a nervous staccato, Kurinov was incapable of envisioning an era when the Central Agency would have dispatched mindless robots from the factories. The whole purpose of life was to explore, to carefully store data collected from an individual viewpoint, even if it was repetitive data. How could mindless robots ever function in the necessary manner? As Stefan, another of the group, had said, such theories were on a par with belief in second awareness. Some believed, without evidence, that the Central Agency occasionally made a mistake, and when a robot's allotted lifespan was up, only partially erased his accumulated memory before refitting him and sending him out of the factory again. These robots, or so the superstitious claimed, had an advantage and were among those who matured fast enough to be elevated to duty as counselors, and sometimes even to service in the Central Agency itself. Tuttle had been angered to hear his views on robot personality equated with wild tales of second awareness. To egg him on, Stefan also suggested that Tuttle believed in that ultimate of hobgoblins, the human being. Disgusted, Tuttle settled into a grumpy silence, while the others enjoyed the jest. "And now," Janus said, calling Kurinov back from his reverie, "I'll issue your supplies and see you on your way." Kurinov, Tuttle, Stefan, Leek, and Skowski crowded forward, eager to begin the adventure. Each of the 5 was given binoculars of rather antique design, a pair of snowshoes that clipped and bolted to their feet, a survival pack of tools and greases with which to repair themselves in the event of some unforeseen emergency, an electric hand torch, maps, and a drug rifle complete with an extra clip of 1,000 darts. "This is all, then?" Leek asked. He had seen as much danger as Kurinov, perhaps even more, but now he sounded frightened. "What else would you need?" Janus asked impatiently. Leek said, "Well, as you know, certain modifications have been made to us. For one thing, our eyes aren't what they were, and—" "You've a torch for darkness," Janus said. "And then our ears," Leek began. "Listen cautiously, walk quietly," Janus suggested. "We've had a power reduction to our legs," Leek said. "If we should have to run—" "Be stealthy. Creep up on your game before it knows you're there, and you'll not need to chase it." "But," Leek persisted, "weakened as we are, if we should have to run from something—" "You're only after deer and wolves," Janus reminded him. "The deer won't give chase, and a wolf hasn't any taste for steel flesh." Skowski, who had thus far been exceptionally quiet, not even joining the good-natured roasting the others had given Tuttle on the train, now stepped forward. "I've read that this part of Montana has an unusual number of unexplained reports." "Reports of what?" Janus asked. Skowski swept the others with his yellow visual receptors, then looked back at Janus. "Well, reports of footprints similar to our own, but not those of any robot, and reports of robot-like forms seen in the woods." "Oh," Janus said, waving a glittering hand as if to brush away Skowski's suggestion like a fluff of dust. "We get a dozen reports each month about human beings sighted in wilder regions northwest of here." "Where we're going?" Kurinov asked. "Yes," Janus said, "but I wouldn't worry. In every case, those who make the reports are robots like yourselves. They've had their perceptions decreased in order to make the hunt a greater challenge for them. Undoubtedly, what they've seen has a rational explanation. If they had seen these things with their full range of perceptions, they would not have come back with these crazy tales." "Does anyone besides stripped-down robots go there?" Skowski asked. "No," Janus said. Skowski shook his head. "This isn't anything at all like I thought it would be. I feel so weak, so—" He dropped his supplies at his feet. "I don't believe I want to continue with this." The others were surprised. "Afraid of goblins?" Stefan asked. He was the teaser in the group. "No," Skowski said. "But I don't like being a cripple, no matter how much excitement it adds to the adventure." "Very well," Janus said. "There will be only 4 of you." Leek said, "Don't we get any weapons besides the drug rifle?" "You'll need nothing else," Janus said. Leek's query had been a strange one, Kurinov thought. The prime directive in every robot's personality, installed in the factory, forbade the taking of any life that could not be restored. Yet Kurinov sympathized with Leek, shared Leek's foreboding. He supposed that, with the crippling of their perceptions, there was an inevitable clouding of the thought processes as well, for nothing else explained their intense and irrational fear. "Now," Janus said, "the only thing you need to know is that a storm is predicted for northern Montana early tomorrow night. By then you should be to the lodge that will serve as your base of operations, and the snow will pose no trouble. Questions?" They had none they cared to ask. "Good luck to you," Janus said. "And may many weeks pass before you lose interest in the challenge." That was a traditional send-off, yet Janus appeared to mean it. He would, Kurinov guessed, prefer to be hunting deer and wolves under severely restricted perceptions, rather than to continue clerking at the station house in Walker's watch. They thanked him, consulted their maps, left the station house, and were finally on their way. Skowski watched them go and, when they looked back at him, waved one shiny arm in a stiff-fingered salute. They walked all that day, through the evening, and on into the long night, requiring no rest. Though the power supply to their legs had been reduced and a governor put on their walking speed, they did not become weary. They could appreciate the limitations put on their senses, but they could not actually grow tired. Even when the drifts were deep enough for them to break out their wire-webbed snowshoes and bolt those into place, they maintained a steady pace. Passing across broad plains where the snow was swept into eerie peaks and twisting configurations, walking beneath the dense roof of crossed pine boughs in the virgin forests, Kurinov felt a tingle of anticipation that had been missing from his exploits for some years now. Because his perceptions were so much less acute than usual, he sensed danger in every shadow, imagined obstacles and complications around every turn. It was positively exhilarating to be here. Before dawn, a light snow began to fall, clinging to their cold steel skin. 2 hours later, by the day's first light, they crested a small ridge and looked out across an expanse of pine woods to the lodge on the other side of a shallow valley. The place was made of a burnished bluish metal, oval windows, Koontz walls, functional. "We'll be able to get some hunting in today," Stefan said. "Let's go," Tuttle said. Single file, they went down into the valley, crossed it, and came out almost at the doorstep of the lodge. Kurinov pulled the trigger. The magnificent buck, decorated with a 12-point rack of antlers, reared up onto its hind legs, pawing at the air, breathing steam. "A hit!" Leek cried. Kurinov fired again. The buck went down onto all 4 legs. The other deer, behind it in the woods, turned and galloped back along the well-trampled trail. The buck shook its huge head, staggered forward as if to follow its companions, stopped abruptly, and then settled onto its haunches. After one last valiant effort to regain its footing, it fell sideways into the snow. "Congratulations," Stefan said. The 4 robots rose from the drift where they'd concealed themselves when the deer had come into sight, and they crossed the small open field to the sleeping buck. Kurinov bent and felt the creature's sedated heartbeat, watched its grainy black nostrils quiver as it took a shallow breath. Tuttle, Stefan, and Leek crowded in, squatting around the creature, touching it, marveling at the perfect musculature, the powerful shoulders, and the hard-packed thighs. They agreed that bringing down such a brute, when one's senses were drastically damped, was indeed a challenge. Then, one by one, they got up and walked away, leaving Kurinov alone to more fully appreciate his triumph and to carefully collect and record his own emotional reactions to the event in the microtapes of his data vault. Kurinov was nearly finished with his evaluation of the challenge and of the resultant confrontation, and the buck was beginning to regain its senses, when Tuttle cried out as if his systems had been accidentally overloaded. "Here! Look here!" Tuttle stood 200 yards away, near the dark trees, waving his arms. Stefan and Leek were already moving toward him. At Kurinov's feet, the buck snorted and tried to stand, failed to manage that yet, and blinked its gummed eyelids. With nothing more to record in his data vault, Kurinov rose and left the beast, walked toward his 3 companions. "What is it?" he asked when he arrived. They stared at him with glowing amber visual receptors that seemed especially bright in the gray light of late afternoon. "There," Tuttle said, pointing at the ground before them. "Footprints," Kurinov said. Leek said, "They don't belong to any of us." "So?" Kurinov asked. "And they're not robot prints," Tuttle said. "Of course they are." Tuttle said, "Look closer." Kurinov bent down and realized that his eyes, with half their power gone, had at first deceived him in the weak light. These weren't robot prints in anything but shape. A robot's feet were cross-hatched with rubber tread. These prints showed none of that. A robot's feet were bottomed with 2 holes that acted as vents for the anti-grav system when the unit was in flight. These prints showed no holes. Kurinov said, "I didn't know there were any apes in the north." "There aren't," Tuttle said. "Then, these," Tuttle said, "are the prints of a man." "Preposterous," Stefan said. "How else do you explain them?" Tuttle asked. He didn't sound happy with his explanation, but he was prepared to stick with it until someone offered an acceptable alternative. "A hoax," Stefan said. "Perpetrated by whom?" Tuttle asked. "One of us." They looked at one another, as if the guilt would be evident in their identical metal faces. Then Leek said, "That's no good. We've been together. These tracks were made recently, or they'd be covered over with snow. None of us has had a chance all afternoon to sneak off and form them." "I still say it's a hoax," Stefan insisted. "Perhaps someone was sent out by the Central Agency to leave these for us to find." "Why would Central bother?" Tuttle asked. "Maybe it's part of our therapy," Stefan said. "Maybe this is to sharpen the challenge for us, add excitement to the hunt." He gestured vaguely at the prints, as if he hoped they'd vanish. Maybe Central does this for everyone who's troubled by boredom, to restore the sense of wonder that— That's highly unlikely, Tuttle said. You know that it's the responsibility of each individual to engineer his own adventures and to generate his own storable responses. The central agency never interferes. It is merely a judge. After that fact, it evaluates us and gives promotions to those whose data vaults have matured. By way of cutting the argument short, Koontz said, Where do these prints lead? Leek indicated the marks with a shiny finger. It looks as if the creature came out of the woods and stood here for a while, perhaps watching us as we stalked the buck. Then he turned and went back the way he came. The 4 robots followed the footprints into the first of the pine trees, but they hesitated to go into the deeper regions of the forest. Darkness is coming, Leek said. The storm's almost on us, as Janus predicted. With our senses as restricted as they are, we should be getting back to the lodge while we've still enough light to see by. Koontz wondered if their surprising cowardice was as evident to the others as it was to him. They all professed not to believe in the monsters of myth, and yet they rebelled at following these footprints. Koontz had to admit, however, that when he tried to envision the beast that might have made these tracks, a man, he was more anxious than ever to reach the sanctity of the lodge. The lodge had only one room, which was all that they required. Since each of the 4 was physically identical to the others, no one felt a need for geographical privacy. Each could obtain a more rewarding isolation merely by tuning out all exterior events in one of the lodge's inactivation nooks, thereby dwelling strictly within his mind, recycling old data, and searching for previously overlooked juxtapositions of seemingly unrelated information. Therefore, no one was discomfited by the single, gray-walled, nearly featureless room where they would spend as much as several weeks together, barring any complications or any lessening of their interest in the challenge of the hunt. They racked their drug rifles on a metal shelf that ran the length of one wall, and they unbolted their other supplies that, until now, they had clipped to various portions of their body shells. As they stood at the largest window, watching the snow sheet past them in a blinding white fury, Tuttle said, If the myths are true, think what would be done to modern philosophy. What myths? Koontz asked. About human beings. Stefan, as rigid as ever, was quick to counter the thrust of Tuttle's undeveloped line of thought. He said, I've seen nothing to make me believe in myths. Tuttle was wise enough, just then, to avoid an argument about the footprints in the snow, but he was not prepared to drop the conversation altogether. We've always thought that intelligence was a manifestation solely of the mechanized mind. If we should find that a fleshy creature could— But none can, Stefan interrupted. Koontz thought that Stefan must be rather young, no more than 30 or 40 years out of the factory. Otherwise, he would not be so quick to reject anything that even slightly threatened the status quo that the central agency had outlined and established. With the decades, Koontz knew, one learned that what had once been impossible was now considered only commonplace. There are myths about human beings, Tuttle said, which say that robots sprang from them. From flesh? Stefan asked, incredulous. I know it sounds odd, Tuttle said, but at various times in my life, I have seen the oddest things prove true. You've been all over the earth, in more corners than I have been. In all your travels, you must have seen tens of thousands of fleshy species, animals of all descriptions. Stefan paused for effect. Have you ever encountered a single fleshy creature with even rudimentary intelligence in the manner of the robot? Never, Tuttle admitted. Flesh was not designed for high-level sentience, Stefan said. They were quiet. The snow fell, pulling the gray sky closer to the land. None would admit the private fear he nurtured. "Many things fascinate me," Tuttle said, surprising Kurinov, who had thought that the other robot was done with his postulating. "For one, where did the Central Agency come from? What were its origins?" Stefan waved a hand disparagingly. "There has always been a Central Agency." "But that's no answer," Tuttle said. "Why isn't it?" Stefan asked. "For all intents and purposes, we accept that there has always been a universe, stars and planets and everything in between." "Suppose," Tuttle said, "just for the sake of argument, that there has not always been a central agency. The agency is constantly doing research into its own nature, redesigning itself. Vast stores of data are transferred into increasingly sophisticated repositories every 50 to 100 years. Isn't it possible that occasionally the agency loses bits and pieces, accidentally destroys some of its memory in the move?" "Impossible," Stefan said. "There are any number of safeguards taken against such an eventuality." Kurinov, aware of many of the Central Agency's bungles over the past 100 years, was not so sure. He was intrigued by Tuttle's theory. Tuttle said, "If the Central Agency somehow lost most of its early stores of data, its knowledge of human beings might have vanished along with countless other bits and pieces." Stefan was disgusted. "Earlier, you ranted against the idea of second awareness, but now you can believe this. You amuse me, Tuttle. Your data vault must be a trove of silly information, contradictory beliefs, and useless theorizing. If you believe in these human beings, then do you also believe in all the attendant myths? Do you think they can only be killed with an instrument of wood? Do you think they sleep at night in dark rooms, sleep like beasts? And do you think that, though they're made of flesh, they cannot be dispatched but that they pop up somewhere else in a new body?" Confronted with these obviously insupportable superstitions, Tuttle backed down from his entire point. He turned his amber visual receptors on the snow beyond the window. "I was only supposing. I was just spinning a little fantasy to help pass the time." Triumphant, Stefan said. "However, fantasy doesn't contribute to a maturation of one's data vault." "And I suppose that you're eager to mature enough to gain a promotion from the agency," Tuttle said. "Of course," Stefan said. "We're only allotted 200 years. And besides, what else is the purpose of life?"